July 1943. The war on the Eastern Front had entered a new and dangerous phase. Only months earlier, the German army had suffered a devastating defeat at Stalingrad. The Soviet Union had survived the German invasion and was now pushing westward. But Adolf Hitler was not ready to surrender the initiative. German commanders were preparing another major offensive. Their target was a large Soviet salient around the city of Kursk. The shape of the battlefield created an opportunity. The Soviet front line pushed outward into German-held territory, creating a large bulge. German planners believed they could attack the northern and southern sides of this salient at the same time. If the two German forces met, they could surround a large number of Soviet troops. The operation was called Citadel. Hitler hoped it would destroy Soviet forces around Kursk and restore German control of the Eastern Front. But the Soviet Union knew an attack was coming. Once again, intelligence became critical. Soviet commanders had information about German preparations. They could see German troops and equipment gathering around the salient. Reconnaissance reports revealed the locations of German formations. The Soviets therefore had time to prepare. Instead of waiting for the German attack without preparation, they transformed the Kursk region into one of the most heavily defended battlefields of the war. Thousands of mines were placed. Anti-tank guns were positioned. Trenches were dug. Defensive lines were constructed one after another. Artillery positions were carefully prepared. The Soviets created multiple defensive belts. If German tanks broke through one line, they would encounter another. And then another. The battlefield was becoming a massive trap. German forces prepared enormous numbers of tanks and armored vehicles. Among them were powerful Panther and Tiger tanks. These vehicles had thick armor and heavy guns. But the German army faced serious problems. The offensive had been delayed. Hitler repeatedly postponed the operation while waiting for additional tanks and equipment. That delay gave the Soviet army even more time to strengthen its defenses. By July 1943, both sides were ready. The German army launched Operation Citadel on July 5th. The attack began in the north and south of the Kursk salient. German artillery opened fire. Aircraft attacked Soviet positions. Then German tanks moved forward. The battlefield became filled with dust, smoke, and explosions. In the northern sector, German forces faced extremely strong Soviet resistance. Soviet minefields slowed the German armored formations. Anti-tank guns opened fire. Soviet aircraft attacked German positions. German troops advanced, but the progress was much slower than expected. In the south, German forces achieved greater success. They pushed through several Soviet defensive positions. German tanks and infantry advanced deeper into the Soviet lines. But every kilometer became more difficult. The Soviets had prepared multiple defensive layers. German forces could not simply break through once and continue toward the objective. They had to fight for every position. The battle became increasingly intense. Tanks fought tanks. Artillery fired continuously. Aircraft attacked ground targets. Infantry followed the armored formations. The battlefield stretched across enormous distances. The fighting was not one single battle. It was a series of enormous clashes across the Kursk region. One of the most famous clashes occurred near Prokhorovka. On July 12th, Soviet and German armored forces fought a massive tank engagement. The battle became one of the most famous armored confrontations of World War II. Tanks moved across the battlefield at close range. Smoke covered the landscape. Crews fought from inside burning and damaged vehicles. The exact scale and character of the fighting at Prokhorovka has been debated by historians. But there is no doubt that the battle represented the intensity of the armored warfare around Kursk. German forces continued attacking. But their momentum was weakening. Soviet reserves were arriving. The Red Army had enormous manpower and equipment resources. German commanders were increasingly concerned about the growing Allied invasion of Sicily. On July 10th, Allied forces had landed in Sicily. Germany now faced pressure in the Mediterranean as well as on the Eastern Front. Hitler's strategic situation was becoming more difficult. Then came the decision that changed the Kursk offensive. The German attack was stopped. The Soviet army moved to the offensive. The Battle of Kursk had entered a new phase. Instead of German troops advancing into Soviet defenses, Soviet forces began pushing German troops backward. The Red Army launched major counteroffensives. German forces were forced to retreat. The Soviet advance continued. Cities such as Oryol and Kharkiv became major objectives. The German army could no longer regain the strategic initiative it had hoped to recover at Kursk. The consequences were enormous. The Battle of Kursk demonstrated that Germany could no longer easily launch major offensive operations against the Soviet Union. The Red Army had become increasingly powerful. Soviet commanders had learned from earlier battles. Their defensive preparations were sophisticated. Their use of artillery and armor had improved. Their industrial production was enormous. The Germans still possessed experienced soldiers and advanced weapons. But Germany was fighting a war it could no longer sustain on favorable terms. The Kursk battle also demonstrated the importance of preparation. The Soviets knew the German offensive was coming. They used the time to create defensive belts. The German army therefore attacked an enemy that was already waiting. Instead of surprising the Soviets, Germany had to fight through a carefully prepared battlefield. The terrain itself became part of the Soviet defense. Mines slowed tanks. Anti-tank guns created deadly corridors. Trenches protected infantry. Artillery struck German formations. The deeper German forces moved, the more difficult the advance became. The German army had hoped for a rapid breakthrough. Instead, it became trapped in a slow battle of attrition. This was exactly the type of war Germany was increasingly struggling to win. The Soviet Union had immense reserves of soldiers and equipment. Germany did not have the same level of resources. Every German tank lost was difficult to replace. Every experienced German soldier lost represented knowledge that could not easily be recreated. The Soviet Union suffered enormous losses too. But Soviet industry was producing large quantities of tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Factories had been moved eastward away from German advances. Production continued. The Red Army became increasingly supplied with weapons. Among the most important Soviet tanks was the T-34. Its combination of mobility, armor, and firepower made it one of the most famous tanks of the war. German Tiger and Panther tanks were powerful, but they were more complicated and expensive to produce. The war was becoming a contest of industrial capacity as much as battlefield skill. Kursk showed that Germany was losing that contest. The battle also had another important consequence. After Kursk, the Red Army increasingly took the initiative. Soviet forces began a long series of offensives that would eventually carry them through Ukraine, Belarus, and Eastern Europe. German forces increasingly fought defensive battles. They were forced to retreat. Cities that Germany had occupied were gradually liberated. The front moved westward. The road toward Berlin was opening. But the human cost was enormous. The Kursk battlefield was covered with destroyed vehicles. Fields were damaged. Villages were destroyed. Thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded.
Tank Cruisefest extraordinary danger.
Inside an armored vehicle, a single enemy shell could change everything. Crews had limited visibility. Smoke could fill the fighting compartment. Heat could become unbearable. Mechanical problems could leave a tank stranded. Yet tanks continued moving forward. The battle also required enormous logistical support. Tanks needed fuel. Artillery needed ammunition. Soldiers needed food and medical supplies. Damaged vehicles needed repairs. The battlefield was constantly moving. Supply lines had to follow. Behind every advancing formation were thousands of people working to keep the army operating. This hidden logistical battle was just as important as the fighting itself. By August 1943, the German offensive was finished. The Soviets had successfully defended the Kursk salient and launched powerful counterattacks. The German army had failed to achieve its main objectives. The strategic initiative had passed to the Soviet Union. This was one of the most important changes of the entire Eastern Front. Germany would still fight fiercely. There would be major German counterattacks. But the era of large successful German offensives in the Soviet Union was effectively ending. From Kursk onward, the Red Army would increasingly determine the direction of the war. The Soviet victory was not cheap. The Red Army suffered enormous casualties. Thousands of tanks and vehicles were destroyed. But the Soviet Union had achieved something strategically important. It had stopped Germany's attempt to regain the initiative. Kursk also became a symbol of the changing nature of the war. In 1941, Germany had launched a massive surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. In 1942, German forces had reached Stalingrad. In 1943, Germany attempted another major offensive. This time, the Soviet army was ready. The difference was enormous. The Red Army had evolved. Its commanders had gained experience. Its soldiers had survived years of brutal warfare. Its factories were producing enormous quantities of weapons. The Soviet Union was no longer simply reacting to German attacks. It was preparing to destroy German forces and advance toward Germany. Kursk therefore became more than a tank battle. It became a strategic turning point. The German army entered the battle hoping to destroy the Soviet salient. Instead, it lost the ability to dictate the direction of the Eastern Front. The Soviets had survived. Now they were advancing. The Battle of Kursk also became famous because of its enormous armored formations. Images of tanks crossing open fields became symbols of Eastern Front warfare. But behind the famous tank battles was a larger story. Intelligence, preparation, industrial production, logistics, air power, artillery, and the ability to replace losses. All of these factors shaped the outcome. The Germans had powerful weapons. But powerful weapons alone could not reverse the strategic situation. The Soviet defensive system absorbed the German attack. Then the Soviet army counterattacked. The result changed the course of the war. After Kursk, Soviet forces continued advancing. The German army increasingly fought to delay the Soviet advance. By the end of 1943, Soviet troops were crossing the Dnieper River. In 1944, Operation Bagration would destroy much of Germany's army group center. The Red Army would move deeper into Eastern Europe. By early 1945, Soviet forces would reach the borders of Germany. And eventually they would fight their way into Berlin. Kursk was one of the steps on that long road. Today, the Battle of Kursk remains one of the most studied armored battles in history. Military historians examine the tactics, equipment, and decisions of both sides. The battlefield has changed. Fields have returned to agriculture. Villages have been rebuilt. But memorials preserve the memory of those who fought. The tanks are gone. The artillery is silent. But the lessons remain. Kursk demonstrated the danger of attacking a prepared enemy. It showed the importance of intelligence and defensive depth. It showed how industrial power can influence battlefield outcomes. And it demonstrated that the German army could no longer dominate the Eastern Front. The battle lasted weeks. Its consequences lasted until the end of the war. Germany had failed to regain the initiative. The Soviet Union had seized it. From that point onward, the Red Army would increasingly move west. The German army would retreat. The war would continue for almost 2 more years. But the direction had changed. Kursk was the battle where the German offensive machine met a Soviet army that was ready, prepared, and increasingly powerful. The result was one of the most important turning points of World War II.